In the hallowed halls of Cornell University's psychology department, a macabre and unsettling artifact is preserved, the brain of Edward Howard Rulloff, held in a glass jar filled with formaldehyde. Its size, a remarkable 1,673 cubic centimeters, makes it one of the largest criminal brains ever recorded, a physical testament to a mind that defied all conventional understanding. This was the brain of a man who could speak 8 languages fluently, translate ancient Greek texts, and formulate groundbreaking theories on human linguistics. Yet, this very mind was also the instrument behind a series of brutal, calculated murders that left 19th-century America in a state of shock and disbelief. For decades, law enforcement and scholars alike struggled to reconcile the immense intellectual brilliance with the cold, unfeeling evil. They sought to understand the man who was a teacher, a doctor, an inventor, and a philologist, yet also a remorseless killer. The newspapers of the time, in their attempt to capture this terrifying paradox, dubbed him the genius killer. His was a story of academic ambition fueled by bloodshed, where the pursuit of knowledge became a twisted obsession that justified the most heinous of crimes. The backdrop for the beginning of this chilling story was the year 1842. Central New York, particularly the Finger Lakes region, was a land of vibrant opportunity and rapid transformation. The newly completed Erie Canal had breathed life into sleepy farming communities, turning them into bustling centers of trade and commerce. The Second Great Awakening had filled the air with religious fervor and social reform movements, creating a society that valued education as a pathway to prosperity. Small towns were in a constant state of competition, vying to attract learned men who could elevate their cultural standing. It was into this landscape of hope and progress that a 23-year-old Edward Rulloff arrived in the quiet village of Dryden, just east of Ithaca. To the locals, he seemed like a gift from Providence itself. He was tall and distinguished, with a commanding presence that immediately set him apart. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his clothing neat and scholarly, and his piercing dark eyes seemed to hold the secrets of a vast and profound knowledge. When he spoke, it was with the cultured accent of an educated gentleman, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. The residents of Dryden had rarely encountered anyone with such apparent erudition. Rulloff claimed an extensive knowledge of botany and medicine, could recite passages in Latin, Greek, and German with fluid precision, and seemed equally comfortable discussing philosophy, literature, and the emerging sciences. When he began delivering lectures on phrenology, the fashionable, though now discredited, pseudoscience of reading character through skull measurements, the townspeople gathered in amazement at his apparent mastery of the field. But beneath this impressive exterior lay secrets that would have horrified his admirers. Born John Edward Howard Rulloffson around 1819 or 1820 in New Brunswick, he had already lived a double life before crossing into the United States. His father had been a prosperous Danish immigrant, but the family's fortunes had declined after his death. Young Edward had shown early promise as a scholar, devouring books with an insatiable hunger, but his intellectual gifts had been corrupted by an early taste for crime. By his teens, he had been caught in a series of suspicious fires at a dry goods store where he worked, apparently designed to cover up inventory thefts. When he was observed wearing clothing that matched stolen items, he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. This experience should have been a wake-up call, but instead, it became his criminal education, teaching him the value of careful planning and the importance of maintaining a respectable facade. After his release, he abandoned his birth name for the more distinguished Edward Rulloff, a change that represented his transformation from a common thief into a far more dangerous predator who could blend seamlessly into respectable society. His years of imprisonment had given him time to study and plan, emerging with a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate others through displays of learning and charm. In Dryden, Rulloff quickly established himself as an invaluable member of the community. He found employment as a clerk in the local drugstore, where his apparent knowledge of botanical medicines impressed both his employer and customers. His learning seemed boundless. He could discuss the latest philosophical works from Europe, analyze political developments with insight, and demonstrate practical knowledge of everything from photography to carpentry. The community, starved for intellectual stimulation in their rural setting, embraced him with an enthusiasm that fed his growing sense of superiority. His reputation grew rapidly, and soon the community offered him the position of headmaster at their local school. This role not only gave him respectability but also access to young minds he could influence and, potentially, corrupt. Among his pupils was 17-year-old Harriet Shutt, the daughter of one of the area's most respected farming families. Harriet was considered a rare beauty, even in a region known for its handsome women. Tall and slender with long light brown hair, she possessed a refined manner and educated speech that marked her as gentry in this rural community. The attraction between teacher and student was immediate and intense, though it would prove to be built on the most dangerous foundation imaginable. Rulloff, despite his scholarly demeanor, possessed a magnetic charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He could be utterly charming when it suited his purposes, weaving tales of his travels and studies that painted him as a man of the world. For a young woman like Harriet, living a sheltered life, he represented everything exotic and sophisticated. But even in these early days, there were warning signs that those around them chose to ignore. Rulloff's temper, when provoked, could be frightening, and he displayed an almost pathological jealousy whenever other men showed even innocent interest in Harriet. On December 31, 1843, Rulloff and Harriet were united in marriage during a simple but well-attended ceremony at the Shutt family farm. The wedding should have been a joyous occasion, but even on this day meant for celebration, Rulloff's true nature began to emerge. When the minister, following a time-honored custom, congratulated the bride with a gentle kiss on the cheek, Rulloff's carefully maintained facade cracked. His face darkened with such fury that several wedding guests stepped back in alarm, and his eyes flashed with a rage so intense and unexpected that it cast a pall over the entire celebration. The guests, unsure how to interpret this disturbing outburst, attributed it to wedding day nerves, but Harriet had seen something in her new husband's eyes that chilled her to the bone. The honeymoon was brief and troubled, marked by moments of passionate devotion interrupted by flashes of the same terrifying rage. Within months, Rulloff had convinced Harriet to move with him to the nearby village of Lansing, a calculated strategy to isolate his young wife from her family's protective influence. In Lansing, Rulloff quickly established himself as a botanical physician, using his self-taught knowledge of herbs and medicines to treat local residents. His reputation as a healer grew rapidly, and soon prominent families throughout the region were seeking his services for everything from common ailments to serious medical emergencies. He charged reasonable fees and seemed genuinely concerned for his patients' welfare, further cementing his reputation as a valuable member of the community. The young couple's modest home became a center of intellectual activity. Rulloff continued his scholarly pursuits, filling their rooms with books on subjects ranging from classical languages to natural philosophy. He spent hours each day reading and writing, working on what he claimed would be groundbreaking theories about the formation and evolution of human language. To observers, he appeared to be the ideal combination of practical healer and theoretical scholar, a man who could bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern learning. In April 1845, after more than a year of marriage, Harriet gave birth to a daughter they named Priscilla. The infant was healthy and beautiful, with her mother's delicate features and what appeared to be her father's intelligent eyes. For a brief time, the arrival of their child seemed to calm Rulloff's volatile nature and bring out genuinely tender qualities that few had suspected he possessed. He appeared devoted to both his wife and infant daughter, spending hours reading to them from his extensive library and discussing his ambitious plans for their family's future. Rulloff spoke frequently of opportunities awaiting him in the growing territories of the American West, particularly Ohio, where he claimed to have been offered a position as a college professor. He painted vivid pictures of the life they could build there, away from the constraints and gossip of small-town New York, where his genius would finally receive the recognition it deserved. These dreams seemed reasonable to Harriet, who had grown accustomed to her husband's grandiose visions and believed in his exceptional abilities, but the domestic tranquility was shattered by the continued presence in their lives of Dr. Henry Bull, Rulloff's business partner and Harriet's cousin. Bull was a genuine physician who had taken Rulloff under his wing, and he was also a member of the extended Shutt family network. Bull's friendly demeanor and family connections, which should have been natural and unremarkable, became the source of Rulloff's growing paranoia and rage. The doctor's habit of greeting Harriet with a kiss on the cheek, the same innocent gesture that had triggered Rulloff's wedding day outburst, drove him into paroxysms of jealous fury. He became convinced that his wife was having an affair with her cousin, despite the complete absence of any evidence to support his suspicions and the ridiculous nature of the accusation given their family relationship. As spring turned to summer in 1845, Rulloff's jealousy reached dangerous proportions. He began following Harriet whenever she left the house, questioning her about every conversation she had with other men, and flying into rages over imagined slights and perceived infidelities. The brilliant scholar, who could discuss philosophy and literature with such eloquence, became a monster of suspicion and violence within the walls of his own home. The crisis that would shatter multiple families began in May 1845 when tragedy struck the extended Shutt clan. Harriet's sister-in-law, the wife of her brother William, fell gravely ill shortly after giving birth. Both mother and infant were suffering from what appeared to be a serious infection, and the family naturally turned to their relative by marriage, who had established himself as a skilled healer. Rulloff agreed to treat them, preparing an herbal remedy and administering it personally with apparent concern for their welfare. Within 48 hours of receiving Rulloff's treatment, both the young mother and her infant child were dead. While such deaths were tragically common in an era before modern medicine and antibiotics, the timing and circumstances struck some family members as suspicious. Rulloff showed no grief at their passing, instead making ominous comments to his mother-in-law about who might go next, words that seemed less like expressions of sorrow and more like veiled threats. The deaths created an immediate and irreparable rift between Rulloff and the Shutt family. Whispers began to circulate about whether the supposed healer had actually hastened the deaths of his own relatives, though no one dared voice such accusations openly. Feeling the weight of his in-laws' suspicion and increasingly desperate to escape, Rulloff became more determined than ever to convince Harriet to abandon her family and move to Ohio. But Harriet, still grieving the deaths of her sister-in-law and infant niece, was reluctant to leave. The couple's arguments became increasingly violent and frequent. Rulloff could not understand why his wife would choose loyalty to her family over devotion to him, and his frustration fed the paranoid conviction that she was being turned against him. On the evening of June 22, 1845, as a summer thunderstorm rumbled across Cayuga Lake, Edward Rulloff committed the crime that would define his legacy and haunt central New York for generations. The humid air was thick with tension as another argument erupted between husband and wife in their small house in Lansing. This time about Rulloff's increasingly desperate demands that they leave immediately for Ohio. Harriet was in the kitchen, engaged in the mundane domestic task of crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, when her husband's rage finally reached its breaking point. He had been drinking, which always made his temper more volatile, and his accusations of infidelity had become more wild and specific. When Harriet laughed off his latest charges and firmly refused his demands to abandon her grieving family, something fundamental snapped in the scholar's brilliant but twisted mind. In an explosion of pure rage, fed by months of building resentment and paranoid jealousy, Rulloff snatched the iron pestle from his wife's hands and brought it down on her forehead with devastating force. Harriet collapsed instantly, blood streaming from the massive wound and pooling beneath her head on the kitchen floor. The sound of the impact and her falling body seemed to echo through the small house, followed by an eerie silence broken only by the rumble of thunder outside. But his crime was not yet complete. As Harriet lay dying, their infant daughter, Priscilla, began to cry in her cradle, disturbed by the commotion and perhaps sensing that something terrible had happened to her mother. The sound of the baby's wailing seemed to pierce through Rulloff's rage, reminding him that he now had a witness to his crime, a witness who would someday grow old enough to remember and testify against him. With the same calculating coldness that had marked his academic pursuits, Rulloff made another terrible decision. Moving to his collection of botanical medicines, he prepared what he later described as a narcotic, likely a concentrated dose of the same plant-based poisons he had been using to treat patients. The preparation of the fatal dose was done with the precision of a trained pharmacist, measuring and mixing ingredients with the same care he had once devoted to healing. Returning to the cradle where Priscilla continued to cry, Rulloff administered the poison with gentle hands. The baby's cries gradually weakened and then stopped entirely, leaving the house filled with the terrible silence that would haunt anyone who had witnessed such evil. In the space of less than an hour, the brilliant scholar had destroyed his entire family, transforming from a respected healer to a cold-blooded killer. The disappearance of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff in late June 1845 sent shock waves through the close-knit community. When concerned neighbors came calling the following day and found Rulloff alone in his house, his explanations raised immediate and profound suspicions that would only deepen with each passing hour. The scene inside the Roof home told a story that contradicted every explanation their host offered. The house bore all the signs of hasty abandonment. Beds were left unmade, dirty dishes were scattered across the kitchen table, and personal belongings were thrown haphazardly throughout the rooms. Most tellingly, Harriet's cherished traveling basket, which she never went anywhere without, still sat prominently on her bureau alongside her jewelry and other precious possessions. Rulloff's attempts to explain his family's absence only deepened the growing mystery and suspicion. His stories changed with each telling, as if he were improvising details as he went along. Initially, he claimed that Harriet and Priscilla had gone to visit relatives in a cottage between Cayuga and Seneca lakes. When pressed for specifics, he couldn't provide exact locations or expected return dates. When this story failed to satisfy questioners, he switched to claiming they were visiting family in Erie, Pennsylvania, and finally settled on an elaborate tale about their relocation to Madison, Ohio. Each new version of events raised more questions than it answered. Why would Harriet leave without her traveling basket and personal effects? How could she have departed without telling her close-knit family where she was going? The more Rulloff talked, the less believable his stories became, and the more convinced his listeners grew that something terrible had happened. When confronted directly about these inconsistencies, Rulloff offered to write a letter to his wife, asking her to contact her family and dispel what he characterized as malicious rumors. The letter was duly written in his precise scholarly hand with flowery language, but days turned to weeks, and no response ever came, a silence that spoke louder than any words could have. For 6 agonizing weeks, Rulloff maintained his increasingly desperate charade, playing the role of the concerned husband whose family was simply traveling for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He continued his practice as a botanical physician, treating patients with the same apparent skill and compassion that had made his reputation, all while knowing that the bodies of his victims lay hidden beneath the dark waters of Cayuga Lake. But the community's suspicions grew stronger and more focused with each passing day. The Shutt family, led by Harriet's protective brothers, William and Ephraim, refused to accept Rulloff's evolving explanations. They knew their sister's character intimately, her deep devotion to family, her responsible nature, and her habit of maintaining regular correspondence with relatives. Her sudden disappearance without a word was completely inconsistent with everything they knew about her personality. The family's investigation took on the character of a determined manhunt, with William and Ephraim Shutt questioning neighbors, searching the surrounding countryside, and applying increasing pressure on their brother-in-law. Their efforts were complicated by Rulloff's continued presence in the community and his ability to maintain his facade of respectability, but their persistence began to yield disturbing information. Several neighbors came forward to report seeing Rulloff on the morning after his family's supposed departure, loading mysterious bundles and what appeared to be a large, heavy chest into a borrowed wagon. Most significantly, multiple people reported seeing him driving the loaded wagon toward Cayuga Lake in the early morning hours, taking a route that led away from any of the destinations he had claimed his family had traveled to. When the pressure of the investigation became too great, Rulloff suddenly vanished from Lansing, claiming he was going to rejoin his family in Ohio and bring them back to silence the unfair accusations. His departure in the middle of the night, without settling his affairs or providing any forwarding address, only confirmed the community's worst suspicions. But Ephraim Shutt was not content to let his sister's suspected killer escape justice. A man of considerable determination and physical courage, he mounted his buckboard and set off in pursuit, beginning a dramatic cross-state manhunt. The chase became a test of wills between a grieving brother seeking justice and a killer desperately trying to escape the consequences of his crimes. The pursuit reached its climax at a crowded train platform in Rochester, where Ephraim spotted Rulloff attempting to board a departing train bound for Buffalo and points west. In a scene that could have been lifted from the pages of a contemporary adventure novel, Rulloff attempted to disappear into the crowd of travelers, but Ephraim's determination proved stronger than his cunning. After a thorough search of the train cars, he found the fugitive hiding in the rearmost compartment. Even when cornered, Rulloff maintained his composure and his deception with remarkable audacity. He expressed surprise and pleasure at encountering his brother-in-law, claiming that the meeting was fortuitous since he was indeed on his way to rejoin Harriet and Priscilla. With characteristic boldness, he even suggested that Ephraim accompany him on the journey to see for himself that his sister and niece were safe. The two men traveled together in an atmosphere of barely concealed tension. The next morning, as they made their way to the crowded docks to catch an early steamboat, Rulloff demonstrated the cunning that would serve him throughout his criminal career. Using the confusion and crowds of a busy port as cover, he managed to slip away from Ephraim's watchful eye. By the time Ephraim realized his quarry had escaped, Rulloff had vanished, leaving his brother-in-law alone and more convinced than ever that Harriet and Priscilla were dead. Back in Lansing, the community organized one of the most thorough criminal investigations of its era. Cayuga Lake, the longest of the 11 glacial Finger Lakes, became the focus of their efforts based on witness reports of Rulloff's suspicious wagon journey. Teams of men worked in shifts, using hooks, nets, and primitive diving equipment to search the lake's murky depths. The search was hampered by the lake's considerable depth, over 400 feet in some areas, providing countless places where weighted bodies could rest undisturbed. Despite weeks of intensive searching, no trace of Harriet or Priscilla was ever found. Meanwhile, the brilliant scholar had not been idle. He made his way to Melville, Pennsylvania, where he established himself under the alias James Nelson. His charisma and apparent learning once again opened doors, and he was soon accepted into the town's intellectual and social circles. In Melville, he was even offered a professorship at Jefferson College, a position that would have fulfilled his academic ambitions while providing perfect cover for his criminal past. But his dreams of respectability were shattered when he was finally tracked down by law enforcement officials and arrested on charges related to his family's disappearance. The legal proceedings that followed would span decades and reveal the dangerous flaws in the American justice system. Without bodies, physical evidence, or eyewitnesses, the prosecution faced an almost impossible task. The grand jury, recognizing the difficulty of proving murder, chose to indict Rulloff on the lesser charge of kidnapping his wife. Rulloff conducted his own defense with the skill and sophistication of a trained attorney, demonstrating a legal knowledge that astonished court observers and frustrated prosecutors. He argued relentlessly on the lack of physical evidence, the absence of bodies, and the entirely circumstantial nature of the case. Despite his brilliance, the jury was ultimately convinced of his guilt by the overwhelming weight of circumstantial evidence and the implausibility of his various explanations. In 1846, he was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor at Auburn State Prison. Rather than breaking his spirit, prison became his university and his laboratory. He threw himself into academic pursuits with obsessive dedication, teaching himself philology, the scientific study of language, and working on a comprehensive treatise he planned to title Method in the Formation of Language. He genuinely believed this work would establish him as one of the foremost linguistic scholars of his generation. His reputation within the prison grew to legendary proportions, and his cell became a destination for curious intellectuals and reformers fascinated by the paradox of such learning existing within a convicted criminal. Among those most influenced by Rulloff's apparent scholarly achievements was Albert Jarvis, the teenage son of the Ithaca undersheriff, who became Rulloff's most devoted student. This relationship would prove crucial to Rulloff's future escapes and criminal enterprises. After serving his full 10-year sentence, Rulloff found Tompkins County authorities waiting with a new warrant, this time charging him directly with the murder of his wife, Harriet. His legal mind immediately grasped the implications and potential defenses, and he argued vigorously that this constituted double jeopardy. The district attorney, recognizing the weakness of the double jeopardy argument, made a tactical decision. he dropped the case for Harriet's murder and instead filed new charges for the murder of infant Priscilla, a separate crime not covered by the double jeopardy protections. The second trial, carefully moved to the nearby town of Owego to ensure an impartial jury, again resulted in a conviction and a sentence of death. But Rulloff's legal education during his imprisonment had not been wasted, and his defense team mounted a sophisticated appeal, arguing that murder could not be proven in the absence of a corpse, a legal principle known as the corpus delicti rule. As his case worked its way through the higher courts, generating considerable legal precedent and scholarly discussion, Rulloff prepared for his most audacious escape yet. In 1858, while confined in the Ithaca jail awaiting the outcome of his appeal, he vanished under circumstances that strongly suggested inside assistance from someone with detailed knowledge of the facility's security procedures. The most likely explanation was that Albert Jarvis, now working for his father, the under-sheriff, and still devoted to his former teacher, had helped orchestrate the breakout. Free once again and now a fugitive from a death sentence, Rulloff embarked on the most productive and dangerous phase of his criminal career. He traveled extensively throughout the Northeast and Midwest, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement while continuing both his scholarly work and his criminal enterprises. His wanted posters described him as extremely dangerous and likely to be armed, but they could not capture the true nature of his threat, a brilliant mind, utterly without conscience, capable of inspiring trust even while planning betrayal. During these fugitive years, Rulloff perfected his techniques of deception and reinvention. Under various aliases, he worked as a teacher, inventor, and photographer, always maintaining the facade of respectability while supporting himself through carefully planned thefts and frauds. His intellectual gifts continued to open doors that his criminal record would have kept closed, allowing him to infiltrate respectable society repeatedly. In 1861, his luck finally ran out when he was captured and returned to New York to face justice. This time, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in Sing Sing prison. But even in this harsh environment, Rulloff managed to thrive, using his intellectual gifts to earn privileges and make valuable connections that would serve his future criminal enterprises. It was at Sing Sing that Rulloff met William T. Dexter, a professional burglar, who would become his partner in the crimes that would ultimately seal his fate. Dexter was impressed by Rulloff's intelligence, recognizing that an alliance with such a brilliant criminal mind could be extremely profitable for both of them. Together with the still loyal Albert Jarvis, they formed a criminal gang that would terrorize the Northeast for nearly a decade. Their criminal methods were sophisticated for the era, focusing on high-end burglaries that targeted stores carrying expensive fabrics and luxury goods. Rulloff's role was as the mastermind and planner. His superior intelligence allowed him to organize their operations with military precision. Based primarily in Brooklyn, the gang operated throughout New York, New England, and Pennsylvania, building a reputation for professionalism and avoiding violence that made them particularly difficult for law enforcement to track. They lived comfortable lives between crimes, with Rulloff continuing his academic work and even attempting to gain recognition in legitimate scholarly circles. In 1869, Rulloff learned of the first convention of the American Philological Association, and he saw it as his golden opportunity to break into legitimate academic circles and gain the recognition he had craved for decades. Under the carefully crafted alias Professor Yuri Laurio, he submitted a manuscript detailing his revolutionary theory of language formation. Rulloff's academic ambitions revealed the true depth of his megalomaniacal personality and his complete disconnect from reality. He genuinely believed that his linguistic theories would revolutionize the field and earn him immortality as one of history's great scholars. His manuscript, Method in the Formation of Language, represented years of obsessive work, and he was convinced it contained insights that would transform human understanding. To demonstrate his confidence and his desperate need for both money and recognition, Rulloff announced his intention to auction the manuscript for the staggering sum of $500,000, a fortune that would be worth millions today. When the Philological Association not only rejected his manuscript but showed no interest whatsoever, Rulloff's fury was volcanic and transformative. The rejection by the very academic community he had spent decades trying to join pushed him over the edge from ambitious criminal to something far more dangerous. If the world would not recognize his genius voluntarily, he would force them to acknowledge it through increasingly bold and violent crimes. The rejection crystallized all of Rulloff's resentments and paranoid beliefs about society's failure to appreciate his exceptional gifts. His crimes after 1869 became more daring and brutal, as if he were challenging law enforcement to catch him while simultaneously punishing a world that had failed to give him his due recognition. It was during this period of escalating violence and desperation that Rulloff's psychopathic nature became most apparent. Modern psychiatrists, examining the historical records of his behavior and statements, have concluded that he displayed virtually every characteristic of clinical psychopathy as we understand it today. He showed no genuine remorse for his victims, possessed a grandiose sense of his own importance, demonstrated a complete lack of empathy for the suffering of others, and maintained an unshakable belief in his own superiority. Yet his charm and intellectual gifts allowed him to continue manipulating those around him with frightening ease. As 1870 dawned, Rulloff was growing increasingly desperate on multiple fronts. His academic dreams had been publicly crushed, his criminal enterprises were barely supporting him, and time was running short for him to achieve the recognition he believed he deserved. The combination of intellectual arrogance, criminal skill, and psychological instability was creating a perfect storm that would soon result in the crime that would finally bring him to justice. Albert Jarvis, still devoted to his mentor, brought Rulloff word of what seemed like the perfect opportunity to solve their financial problems. The Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton had recently received a large shipment of expensive silks from New York City, exactly the kind of high-value, easily portable merchandise their gang had made their specialty. The store's location near the Chenango River provided multiple escape routes, and the presence of only 2 young clerks as night security made it seem like an ideal target. Jarvis had done careful reconnaissance, timing the clerks' routines and identifying the best entry and exit points. Everything seemed perfectly planned for what they expected would be their most profitable score yet. But criminal genius, as events would soon prove, was not the same as academic brilliance, and Rulloff's intellectual arrogance would finally lead him to make the mistakes that had eluded him for so many years. The early morning hours of August 17, 1870, were humid and oppressively still as 3 shadowy figures approached the Halbert Brothers dry goods store in Binghamton with the confidence of experienced professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. Edward Rulloff, Albert Jarvis, and William Dexter had spent days studying the building's layout, the habits of the 2 young clerks who lived above the store, and the best routes for both entry and escape. Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs were typical of their era, young men from working-class families who lived above their place of employment both for convenience and security. Neither young man was prepared for what was about to unfold, nor could they have imagined that they were about to confront one of the most dangerous criminal minds in American history. They had settled into their cots, trusting in their vigilance and the pistol that Merrick kept under his pillow. The burglars' plan seemed foolproof. They would enter through the rear of the building, subdue the sleeping clerks with chloroform, and make off with the most valuable silks. Rulloff, the intellectual mastermind, had convinced himself that his superior planning and understanding of human nature would ensure their success. His partners trusted completely in his leadership. Moving like ghosts through the darkened streets, the 3 men made their way to a basement entrance. In the basement, they donned masks and removed their shoes to muffle their footsteps. The chloroform was lit and allowed to burn, filling the air with its sickly sweet vapor. Then, step by careful step, they began their ascent toward the quarters where Merrick and Burroughs lay sleeping, completely unaware that their lives were about to be changed forever. But even the most carefully laid plans can be undone by a single moment of carelessness. In the darkness of the unfamiliar building, Albert Jarvis stumbled over an unseen obstacle, sending a crash echoing through the structure that shattered the night's silence like a gunshot. The sound jolted both clerks instantly awake. In the space of seconds, the carefully planned operation had descended into chaos, with 3 desperate criminals facing 2 determined young men who were prepared to fight for their lives. Frederick Merrick, displaying remarkable courage, reacted with speed and determination. Grabbing the pistol he kept under his pillow, he aimed it at the fleeing figure of Rulloff and pulled the trigger. The weapon clicked but failed to discharge, a misfire that would ultimately cost the brave young clerk his life. Undeterred, Merrick seized a heavy wooden stool and hurled it at the intruders. Meanwhile, Gilbert Burrows had thrown himself at William Dexter. When Merrick rushed to help his colleague, the tide of battle seemed to be turning in favor of the defenders, and for a moment, it appeared that the two brave clerks might actually succeed in capturing or driving off their attackers. But it was then that Edward Rulloff made the decision that would finally bring his decades-long criminal career to an end and transform him from master thief to cold-blooded killer. Drawing the pistol he carried for exactly such emergencies, Rulloff fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to intimidate the clerks into submission without actually harming them. But the brave young men refused to yield to threats. And Merrick threw himself at Jarvis with such fury and determination that Rulloff felt compelled to fire a second warning shot into the ceiling. When Merrick still would not desist, continuing his attack on Jarvis with the desperate courage of a man fighting for his life and livelihood, Rulloff's patience and self-control finally snapped completely. In a moment that would haunt him for the remaining months of his life, he pointed his weapon directly at the young clerk's head and pulled the trigger without hesitation or remorse. The bullet struck Frederick Merrick instantly, killing him where he stood and spattering his blood across the walls of the room where he had lived and worked. The brilliant scholar who could recite ancient poetry in a dozen languages, who had spent years developing theories about human communication and the evolution of language, had just committed the most primal act of violence possible, taking another human life in cold blood. The sound of the fatal gunshot seemed to freeze time for a moment, as if the universe itself was recoiling from the evil that had just been committed. Then Gilbert Burrows, realizing that his colleague was dead and that he was now facing three desperate killers who had nothing left to lose, made the wise decision to flee and raise the alarm rather than continue a fight he could not win. Racing through the building and bursting onto the street, Burrows began screaming for help at the top of his lungs, alerting the entire neighborhood to the tragedy that had just unfolded. His cries shattered the night air and brought people running from nearby buildings, including law enforcement officers, who immediately began organizing a manhunt for the killers. The three criminals fled the scene in panic, racing toward the Chenango River, where they believed they could make good their escape under cover of darkness. But fear and desperation had clouded their judgment, and the confidence that had marked their approach to the crime had evaporated in the face of their transformation from burglars to murderers. Albert Jarvis, perhaps influenced by his scholarly mentor's overconfidence or simply desperate to escape, assured his companions that the river was shallow enough to wade across safely. It was a fatal miscalculation that would cost 2 lives and seal Rulloff's fate as surely as if he had signed his own death warrant. As the 3 men plunged into the dark waters of the Chenango, the true depth and power of the river became immediately apparent. Jarvis, wounded in the struggle and weakened by blood loss, was quickly overwhelmed by the current and swept away into the darkness. Dexter, who had never learned to swim, followed his partner into the depths, his cries for help swallowed by the rushing water. Only Edward Rulloff, the mastermind whose brilliant planning had led them to this disaster, managed to struggle to the far shore, gasping and exhausted, but alive. As he dragged himself onto the riverbank, he could hear the sounds of the growing manhunt behind him, dogs barking, men shouting, and the organized chaos of a community mobilizing to capture the killers who had just murdered one of their own. Rulloff's attempt to escape Binghamton on foot proved equally disastrous, demonstrating that even his superior intellect could not overcome the consequences of his crimes. At the railroad station, when police officers asked him to identify himself as part of their systematic search for suspects, he made the crucial mistake of running rather than attempting to talk his way out of the situation. This behavior immediately marked him as a fugitive and sealed his capture. His apprehension in a nearby farm's outhouse was almost anticlimactic for a man who had eluded justice for so many years through wit and charm. The brilliant criminal who had manipulated judges, juries, and law enforcement officials for decades was finally brought down by his own panic and the simple persistence of local police work. Even in custody, Rulloff attempted to maintain his lifelong pattern of deception and manipulation, first claiming to be Charles Augustus and then George Williams when pressed for identification. But his past had finally caught up with him in the person of Judge Ransom Balcom, a local official who had followed the notorious case for years and immediately recognized the infamous fugitive despite his attempts at disguise. The judge's dramatic declaration, "You are Edward H. Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845, rang through the crowded police station like a thunderclap, finally connecting decades of unsolved crimes to the man who stood before them. His additional warning to the authorities, this man understands his rights better than you do, and will defend them to the last," proved prophetic as Rulloff immediately began the legal maneuvering that would mark his final trial. The physical evidence linking Rulloff to the Halbert store murder was overwhelming and undeniable. He had fled the scene without his shoes, and the left shoe found at the crime scene was unmistakably his, stuffed with pieces of cloth to accommodate the missing big toe he had lost to frostbite years earlier. The distinctive modification made the shoe as identifying as a fingerprint, providing proof that even Rulloff's legal skills could not challenge. Documents found on the bodies of Jarvis and Dexter when they were recovered from the Chenango River led investigators to Rulloff's Brooklyn apartment, where they discovered a treasure trove of evidence documenting his double life as scholar and criminal. Maps, stolen goods, false identification papers, and academic manuscripts were found side by side, providing a complete picture of the complex man who had terrorized the Northeast for decades. The trial that began on January 4, 1871, became a sensation that attracted crowds of over 2,000 people daily. Newspapers across the nation sent reporters to cover the proceedings, fascinated by the paradox of America's most intellectual killer and the questions his case raised about the nature of genius and evil. Once again, Rulloff conducted his own defense with the skill and sophistication that had impressed legal observers for decades. But this time, the evidence was too strong and the crimes too clear for even his brilliant advocacy to overcome. The prosecution presented a methodical case linking him to the murder through physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and his long history of criminal behavior. Even as he faced certain execution, Rulloff maintained the grandiose delusions that had driven his entire criminal career. He petitioned Governor John T. Hoffman to delay his execution until he could complete his linguistic theories, claiming that his work method in the formation of language would benefit all humanity and that executing him would deprive the world of invaluable scientific insights. Some prominent figures, including newspaper editor Horace Greeley, actually supported this request, arguing that such a brilliant mind was too valuable to waste regardless of his crimes. Greeley wrote in the New York Tribune, "There is a man awaiting death who is too curious an intellectual problem to be wasted on the gallows." Mark Twain, with characteristic wit and insight, satirized these clemency efforts, offering to provide a substitute criminal to be executed in Rulloff's place if it would preserve such valuable intellectual property for humanity. His mockery highlighted the absurdity of suggesting that intelligence should exempt anyone from the consequences of murder. But all appeals failed, and on March 3, 1871, Edward Howard Rulloff was sentenced to hang for the murder of Frederick Merrick. As he awaited execution, he finally confessed to murdering his wife, Harriet, describing in chilling detail how he had struck her with the iron pestle in a fit of jealous rage. However, he never confessed to killing his daughter Priscilla, though he acknowledged giving her a narcotic to stop her crying. On May 18, 1871, before a bloodthirsty crowd of thousands of spectators, Edward Howard Rulloff met his end at the gallows in what would be recorded as New York State's final public hanging. His final words, according to various accounts, were either, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner," or simply, "I can't stand still," reflecting the complex mixture of bravado and terror that had marked his entire criminal career. Even in death, Rulloff's story continued to fascinate and horrify the public. Dr. Burt Wilder of Cornell University removed his brain within hours of the execution for scientific study, declaring it the second largest criminal brain on record. The brain remains on display at Cornell's Wilder Brain Collection to this day, a macabre monument to one of America's most complex and dangerous killers. Rulloff's case forced 19th-century America to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of intelligence, morality, and criminal behavior. His story challenged prevailing beliefs that linked criminal behavior to low intelligence and social class, proving that evil could wear the mask of respectability and that intellectual brilliance was no guarantee of moral character. The case contributed significantly to the development of criminal psychology as a field of study, with Rulloff becoming one of the first American criminals to be systematically studied by scientists. His preserved brain was subjected to every test available to 19th-century science, but no physical abnormalities could explain the evil that had resided within it. Today, more than 150 years after his death, Edward Rulloff remains a subject of fascination for criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts. Modern psychologists have concluded that he displayed virtually every characteristic of what we now understand as psychopathy, making him a textbook example of this dangerous personality disorder. His story prefigured many of the themes that would define modern understanding of serial killers and psychopaths: the charming facade, the grandiose self-image, the complete lack of empathy, and the ability to manipulate others. In many ways, he was America's first celebrity serial killer, a man whose crimes were overshadowed only by the terrifying brilliance of the mind that conceived them. The case of the genius killer serves as an eternal reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most civilized, and that the capacity for evil exists independently of intelligence, education, or social standing. Edward Rulloff's legacy is not the linguistic theories he believed would make him immortal, but rather the chilling demonstration that genius without conscience becomes a weapon capable of destroying innocent lives.